See if I still can do that. All right, so we're talking about food today. I've kind of come to find out that, I've got some weird, like computer or monitor issue. And so I've got two screens and I can't ever figure out which screen's camera is going. So it's going to look like I'm looking away, but I'm still here. Through doing these, I've definitely realized that I have a particular interest within kind of food and nutrients and how it connected to different things that we've eaten kind of over the course of evolution. So it's a really, really fascinating and interesting topic. It's something that a lot of people hold dear. It's very personalized. People have a lot of joy from eating food. I'm going to have more of the conversation around health and how it connects back into, our individual function and disease prevention and longevity. So I'm not going to waste too much time. You guys all know who I am. I've done a lot of pull-ups in my days. I've got a little kiddo. I've got a wife, and founder of Central Athlete. I've got a personal connection with each and every one of you, and I appreciate you guys being here today. So you guys have probably all heard me talk about kind of like a spectrum. We all exist amongst different spectrums, within different things. And so very simply put, there's a higher and lower order perspective to how I'm going to talk about food today. So it goes from an inadequate food profile all the way up to what I would consider the highest order food profile. And so we're going to kind of go from the bottom up and talk about what it looks like. This is probably the most fun part of putting this together, was looking for images that kind of spoke to, what I saw as an inadequate food profile. But what I see here is, this is really, I really don't deal or have the opportunity or privilege to work with these individuals. These people are largely unaware. I would say this is, this and kind of the deficient food profile is, if you look at the United States, this is where a lot of people live. I'm hesitant to say the majority, but a good amount of people live in this kind of unaware state, very low nutrient density. This is a very, very, very recent diet phenomenon, where it is, how convenient can I get nutrients into my body? Highly processed, nutrient void, but a lot of times it's delicious, delectable food. I'm just kind of looking through this image. Maybe that's not the most accurate statement, but highly processed foods here. Deficient. Genesis this is kind of closer to, the 70s to 90s. This is, I think, more about like, the food pyramid, the food guidelines, and some low fat sentiment. This is really the standard American diet, where the main focus or the main piece of awareness is just on how delectable the food is, how great is it going to taste. So, you've got things like waffles and orange juice and donuts for breakfast in the morning. You have some sort of sandwich for lunch. And then you're going to have some sort of processed food dinner in the evening time. Again, very, very, very low nutritional value here. A lot of the foods are going to connect back into how it's going to affect neurotransmitters. So, foods are going to be encouraging the release of dopamine, serotonin, and really relaxing the individuals. A lot of times I see working with these individuals that, combined with this, they have a higher stress life. And so they like to have control over their food, and the food is very much relaxing and enjoyable and pleasurable. But, from what we know now, this starts to bite us in the butt later on down the road. They have a little bit more awareness than the inadequate group. They may have heard, this food's healthier than this one, or this food is not. They may be subject to, marketing claims. You'll see things like you buy a box of cereal and 100% whole grains, or, low fat yogurt or something like that. And so those things are kind of taken as like, okay, this is a healthy food, thus I'm going to buy it. Then we get good enough. This is kind of the next tier, and this works really, really, really well for individuals who are seeking kind of weight reduction or body compositional changes. So again, a higher level of awareness here. These individuals are going to start to zone in on kind of macronutrients and understand that if the, you know, shift the composition of the foods that they're consuming, that they can have certain effects. You know, so altering the amount of protein, altering the amount of fat, altering the amount of carbohydrates that they're eating, and then that connects back into how they're going to manipulate body composition. One of the downsides to this is that although nutrient density is higher and it's a little bit more balanced, there still isn't an optimal amount of food quality, right? You can still get incredibly lean and ripped and jacked, whatever adjective you want to use, by using kind of if it fits your macros type approach. However, there is really no conversation around food quality and how that connects back into disease prevention, longevity, mental acuity, energy management. So again, some people on this call are coaches. I use this framework as an idea for how I'm going to progress an individual. Of course, in a perfect world, you know, my biases would want to encourage somebody to eat the optimal diet for that individual. But if somebody's eating, you know, an inadequate or deficient diet, you know, maybe instead of, you know, they're eating a sandwich on white bread, I'm trying to have them eat, you know, a sandwich with oven roasted turkey without preservatives on wheat bread, right? So still maybe not the most optimal thing from a nutrient density perspective, but it's one step up. Similar philosophy here. The genesis of this is, you know, roughly, you know, about 100 years or so ago, this kind of came into our collective understanding of how we can influence our bodies and body's composition. So, you know, very balanced diet here: grains, dairy, beans, legumes, seafood, meats, nuts, vegetables, fruit, eggs, and nuts. One thing I did not mention with the inadequate and deficient group, if I'm advising those people in the form of exercise, it's only walking. You know, their body just is not going to respond optimally to different forms of exercise. You know, even like easy aerobic work can be challenging for those people to recover due to diminished amino acid profiles. You know, improper energy management. These people have a hard time being consistent. So as we get to the good enough profile, we can start to undertake aerobic, strength, and breathing work for these characters. Ideal. This is the next one. This came into our collective understanding. You know, really one of the main guys who popularized this way of understanding food and nourishment is a individual named Loren Cordain. He wrote the Paleo Diet back, I believe, in the 90s. And, you know, the genesis of this diet, well, this is something that we were eating right around, you know, prior to the agricultural revolution. So somewhere in the range of like 13 to 10,000 years ago or so. Very high nutrient density here. Essentially, the premise is, you know, if you are camping in the wild, if you can somehow gather it or hunt it or forage for it, go ahead and eat it. Otherwise, probably avoid it. So things like bread would be a little bit harder to come by with this food profile, right? If you're camping in the woods, it's very, at least my understanding, I don't know how to like harvest wheat and mill it and bake it into some sort of loaf of bread, right? I might get a tuber and that would be my carbohydrate source. And I might be able to kill a squirrel and get some loquats from a loquat tree. But bread likely wouldn't be there. This diet has a big connection to the natural world. So anything that exists from air, land, trees, and water, the focus is going to be on all things natural. And there's going to be a very high level of awareness for these individuals. Honestly, some people can stop here through this kind of progression towards food, and they can be great, right? This can be a really, really, really good place to end up, and you can have an excellent balance of body composition, mental acuity, energy management, and people feel great here, and there's no need to keep kind of pushing them kind of to a higher order. I did a lot of, I'm personally very interested in what different people have eaten over the years. And so also understand that there is regional differences from what different people have eaten over the years. So for example, there's a great study called the Inuit study. And, we studied Inuit Indians or Eskimos, and we have a lot of data on them and what they ate for years and years. And then with the advent and introduction of processed foods into the diet, how did that affect their physiology? But Inuit, one thing, they talk about in that study is Inuit Indians eat almost primarily protein and fat, or at least, kind of with particular seasons. In the summer, they'll continue to eat, whale blubber, seal blubber, very high fat, protein rich foods, but they'll eat little lichens and stuff that are growing in between rocks. And so you have almost like a ketogenic type diet, or a very low carbohydrate diet. And then in Tanzania, you have the Hadza, which are eating like baobab fruits. They're eating certain tubers. They're foraging and hunting for other things that they can come across. They have a little bit more carbohydrates in their diet. So based upon where our ancestry came from, we're eating different things. So kind of one thing that I wanted to point out. When the advent of agriculture came around, right, we saw a lot of changes happen. And so for hunter-gatherer societies, we were able to have a kid roughly what they estimate is every 3.5 years. By the time that we were able to create monocrops and start to develop farms, not just for our own family's needs, but also, selling it commercially, that moved the average age of birth between kids every 2.5 years. So we saw this rapid explosion from our population. And before long, farmers started to outnumber hunter-gatherers. So kind of like an interesting piece of, how the agricultural revolution, how that shifted things into, what we see a lot of with, the inadequate, deficient, and good enough food profiles. But our genome hasn't quite changed a ton since, about 13,000 years ago. So connecting back with these, wholesome, nutritious foods that are, I'm just going to call them close to the ground, are just great for our health without kind of going into a ton of detail. You can still have degrees of personalization here. So, that comes in the foods in the realm of amount and how frequently, and maybe the composition of those foods. So you're still able to personalize, maybe kind of a macronutrient balance within an ideal food profile. You can also connect this back into, where my ancestry came from, right? If I came from sub-Saharan Africa versus Asia versus Europe, I may want to think about integrating different foods into my diet. There are some populations who can handle certain foods. So there's a couple kind of controversial subjects within this realm. One of those being grains. Grains is something that there actually is evidence that we've been eating grains longer than we previously knew. So some populations have been eating grains. I've seen things maybe 15 to 20,000 years ago. There's records of that with I think dental imaging that they've done with remains that they've found. So understanding kind of how it connects back into our ancestry. Also dairy is more of a modern kind of thing that we've been doing, hunter-gatherers really didn't domesticate animals and have dairy. And Asian and African-American populations did not have domestic, what's the word? Like cows, there's another word for cow I'm thinking of. And so Asians and African-Americans have a harder time processing dairy than their Caucasian counterparts. So those are some other degrees of personalization. Then you get to a worthy food profile. So think, somebody is thinking about the composition of the foods. They're thinking about the food quality, right? So this connects back into a very kind of natural state. But now we're also thinking about kind of the cleanliness of the food. And so in what manner was our food grown? There's a health perspective here, but there's also a sustainability and kind of like global consciousness piece here as well. And so, you know, are we eating things that are factory farmed and fed, that are, GMO, so GMO fed cows in an industrial setting, in closed pens in a not so happy environment? Or is this a free range cow that is grass fed and has, you know, a pasture to roam? That's going to influence, the nutrient profiles of these animals that we consume. It's going to influence, you know, whether or not they have antibiotics, and, you know, if that gets into our system as well. These individuals have an even higher awareness, again, even higher nutrient density, which connects back into the organic nature. There is, a couple things that y'all can, kind of consider here. Is there is kind of some ways to kind of like hack this profile. If y'all have heard like of the clean 15 and the dirty dozen, the clean 15, these are 15 foods that really don't matter whether or not it's organic. Say, for example, like a banana. If I spray a banana with pesticides, like maybe a small amount actually gets into the banana that I'm going to eat, but a lot of it, right, when I peel off the banana peel, I'm getting rid of a lot of any pesticides, herbicides that it picks up. The dirty dozen, those are things where you always want to think about staying organic with those foods. I think blueberries is one of those. Blueberries are like little like toxin sponges. If you look at kind of like toxin reports relative to different foods and fruits. Again, we've got, very similar food profile relative to the ideal food profile. We have also a complete amino acid, fatty acid, micronutrient, fiber, vitamin, mineral, and water profile. In one of my previous talks, I actually went through how I analyze this. Chronometer is the tool that I use specifically, where I'm able to analyze somebody's nutrient density. I actually want to pull it up here because I think it's such an excellent tool. And this can give us some really, really, really good insight into the level of optimization within food quality. So you can edit a lot of these fields and augment, how much magnesium, but it's just going to start off with kind of like the RDAs for the recommended dietary allowances for specific nutrients. I'm going to go to an anonymous client here who I think is going to have something up. Boom. And we're able to see nutrient density for this specific client. So this is a great tool. I can see that this client hit 93% of their target goals. I can see that iron is something that they tend to not get adequate amounts of. And this is just a really helpful tool. I'm like, oh man, what's an iron? What foods have iron in it? Okay, liver, mushrooms, mollusks, lima beans, spinach. Super helpful tool to create awareness for both the coach and the client. And then it's easy to start to shift the nutrient profile to the foods that are going to increase the food quality of their personal diet. Okay. And then we have the highest order. Let's see if I can do something here. Okay, what I would consider the highest order food profile here. So where we get here is, this is going to be, sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. This is going to be highly personalized. So again, we're kind of building off of the previous steps, with the inadequate, deficient, good enough, ideal, and worthy food profiles. This is going to be something that's very natural. It's going to be something that is something that you can gather, you can hunt, you can kind of find in nature. So a very, very close to the ground diet. These people are extremely aware, and they are at the transcendent state, which is real mastery within a nutrient profile. It takes years and years, if not decades, to get to this point. It also connects back with some principles of how our ancestors ate hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so if you think about that, that's not just from like a what to eat perspective of like, okay, eat broccoli instead of brownies, right? Also think about some of the patterns around food. And so we tended to eat food in kind of like a tribal sense, right? We oftentimes ate with people sharing food. There were times where we ate a lot of food, and there were times where we ate not as much food, right? So feast and famine. If you think about it, this is actually a really interesting thing that I thought about the other night. There are some people who have gone their entire life without truly experiencing hunger, right? They might have had like a momentary hunger pain a couple times in their life, but they've never actually truly been hungry to the degree that we have been hungry for hundreds of thousands of years. Also, a highly seasonal diet, right? It's kind of an odd premise that I can eat a banana in the middle of December, right? Flown in from Ecuador. I have heard and read some literature and some thoughts around how, right, as human beings, we have our own circadian rhythm, but also plants and animals have their own circadian rhythm as well. And there's not a ton of research, but there are some kind of introductory lines of thinking around how eating things that are not seasonal can be, in some sense, confusing our biology. I'm not sure myself what to exactly make of that, but it just seems to be a higher order prescription to be eating a highly seasonal diet. And then also from an awareness standpoint, that's something that I personally always have to look up. I'm like, when the hell are like sweet potatoes and figs and butternut squash in season versus radishes, kale, and broccoli? I always have to revisit that information. So it's something that I'm personally working on, kind of within my progression here as well. A couple other things that I think about here, the types of birth that a person experiences is something that I do take into consideration. When we have different types of birth, it's going to affect our immune system and our microbiome, right? I would consider a higher order birth and breastfeeding to increase the chances of a strong immune system. I'm going to go as far to say this is fact. There's a ton of research that's been done in this realm. I know not everybody is going to agree with that statement, but when I see those types of things, or the inflection of that, so when I see people who were formula fed, people who were not born vaginally, I do see in my own practice an increased prevalence of food intolerances. So I am a little bit more specific with helping them understand what foods work well for them and what foods don't work well with them. And on the contrary, the people who have had a higher order birth, I do see just an increased resiliency from a food profile. These people can get by with a little bit more booze, a little bit more dairy, a little bit more grains without it affecting them. Now, this isn't like a black and white statement. I think there's a lot of shades of gray here, but I do notice some connections there. For coaches, asking good questions for some of the things that I'm going to talk about, such as, do you remember how you were born? Were you breastfed? Were you formula fed? These can be some insightful questions to ask that can help guide the food profile. Between the ages of, and I actually have an interesting, I can share the link here. I've got a PubMed study called Weight Management, State of Science and Opportunities. It's kind of what we understand as some of the prenatal factors, things that happen preconception, things that happen in adolescence and adulthood. Really kind of interesting stuff, things that impact kind of our propensity towards obesity or being overweight. I'm sure we've all like seen those people, right? I have friends or clients that I've worked with before in the past, and they said, man, I stared at a loaf of bread and I like gained 5 pounds. Whereas, I'm a little bit more insensitive to carbohydrates. I can eat 500 grams of carbohydrates per day, and I can eat 50 grams of carbohydrates per day. And I'll notice some changes, but I'm not going to turn into a blimp if I eat 500 grams of carbohydrates per day. So the point I was going to make is that between 0 and 2 years old, that's going to dictate the number of fat cells that you have and your overall health. Right? So sugary foods, inflammatory foods, between the ages of 0 and 2 years old, I personally would have a little pause there for feeding, a little kiddo those types of food. Fat cells are placed for waste disposal. And if we negatively influence our physiology between the ages of 0 and 2 years old, there's going to be a bigger preclusion to store toxins. Some other things to think about, right? So I think 200,000 years ago, what were we eating? I think about, okay, what were we eating when we were, super duper young, about actually a year preconception to, about, right, really through adolescence. I think that gives some good insight into what to advise people. But also, last week's food dictates our food profile as well. So our microbiome is going to change anywhere from about 30 to 60% within a week. And when I excrete or I eliminate, have a bowel movement, 50% of my microbiome is within that bowel movement within a given day. So some interesting pieces of how what I'm eating within kind of a 1 to 2 week period also kind of influences my physiology. Our microbiome is rapidly changing, or maybe not changing if I'm just eating the same things over and over again, but it has a propensity to change. Changes in food can create sickness in some people and a metabolic boost in others. And so kind of within the realm of naturopathy, they call it a healing crisis. A lot of times if you take somebody, say you take like an obese individual, and for whatever reason you thought putting this person on a water fast for 5 days, let's say, was a great idea. Sometimes those people can have a healing crisis and they get very, very, very ill. Right? It's an acute response, but that's been documented anecdotally over and over and over again. I've also seen that happen in the form of injuries where people have been on the fast and they took a rock climbing, I'm thinking of one person, they took a rock climbing accident like 25 years ago and they haven't had any knee pain after that rock climbing accident. And they went through the water fast and their knee was killing them. So those are called a healing crisis. Whereas if we just, with a healthy individual, say they don't get sick and you shift their food profile, say they're eating a high carbohydrate diet, and then this is an isocaloric shift, meaning that they're eating the exact same amount of calories between each situation. And they shift them from a high carbohydrate diet to a higher protein, moderate fat diet with lower carbohydrates. There can be a metabolic boost there. Part of it can be connected to the higher thermic effect of protein, but also there's different digestive enzymes that have to up and down regulate in order to digest said foods. So that can be a potential explanation for it as well. So shifting the food profile can actually be something that is helpful for a lot of individuals. But think about how this connects back into the seasonality. So if we're thinking about the Inuit Indians and it's winter, they're eating almost entirely fat and protein. By the time they get to summer and spring, they're starting to get little lichens and maybe, other little living vegetation that they're able to forage for during the warmer months. So you can see from an evolutionary context how food composition has shifted from season to season. There are epigenetics factors that I'm going to stay away from that one. Nope, not going there. Another consideration talking about the microbiome is this is also a reflection of our defense system, of our immune system. So thinking about how foods connects back into our microbiome, that thus affects our immune system. This is a very critical conversation, especially with what is going on with COVID right now. Just under 90% of people have comorbidities. Obviously I have this is kind of one realm I know a lot about. My belief is that, if we at least have a conversation around how we feed everybody in the United States, we can start to shift people's health. Now it's a very complicated issue and, there needs to be, policy changes and subsidies that change and whatnot. But, specifically if you give access to lower socioeconomic classes, you give them access to healthier foods, you make them cheaper, and then you subsidize some of the more unhealthy foods. I think that might be part of a long-term strategy towards increasing our health as a whole. Just kind of a thought. As we get into kind of kiddos and adolescents, one of my main filters, if I'm supporting them or I'm supporting, a parent who is feeding a kid, is really I'm thinking about growth and cognitive abilities and energy management. So I'm thinking about how is nutrition, how is that fueling growth, right? It's a little bit more complex than, little Jimmy needs, 2,500 calories and it doesn't matter what he's getting. It's also important that he gets the right micronutrients and the right balance of particular micronutrients relative to each other. I think another interesting point with an optimal diet is to reverse engineer essentially what kills us. And so some of the things that are going to kill us are going to be genetic mutations, just general wear and tear, and then toxin accumulation. So kind of understanding the things that might take us down and starting, right, we can do that on a personal basis. So I know personally that I have more of a risk for cardiovascular disease. So I'm a little bit more cognizant with, my intake of carbohydrates and fatty acids and whatnot. So understanding kind of within our own kind of epigenetic factors, what are the things that potentially going to take us down the road? I think that's kind of interesting to think about. And the last thing, I think I'm going to be cut off for some reason. We're having Zoom technical difficulties here, and I've got a timer on here. But the last thing I wanted to talk about too was, this is something that was suggested for me, it's really easy to kind of get locked into a particular way of thinking within kind of nutrition. And a lot of people live in these camps, like I'm keto, I'm a faster, I'm a paleo. And over the years, like I've recognized that it all kind of works. And I've drawn more towards an agnostic lens. But I think a really, really helpful argument that I think or exercise is to argue for the things that you don't believe. So I personally believe that eating meat was something that likely led to the development of our Homo sapien brains and, gave us, kind of these cognitive abilities that we have today. So something that I've tried to do is actually argue for a vegetarian or a vegan food profile. And it's a really interesting thing to do because I had to do a lot of research to understand kind of some of the premises and the thoughts behind that. And one thing that I did learn was the sentiment behind a vegetarian and vegan diet is a very, 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 it comes from a good place, right? I don't want to take part in a world with killing, or I want to be a conscious consumer. And it was a really, really interesting experience to go through. So I'll kind of leave it at that. That's kind of how I will assess people's food profile from a lower to higher order perspective. And we've got 2 minutes, so let's blast any Q&As quickly. And I'm going to do my best to try to answer anything here.
Jesse, do you have any tips for after a tough workout or strength session, I get migraines, and I try and eat something sugary right after that, and then wait an hour and eat something more protein based. But I'd say there's a significant fraction of the time where I'll just get hit with a migraine later that evening. Or
yeah, do you connect it back into the intensity of your training at all, or thermoregulation, your ability to regulate your temperature, or is it just?
It's more common when I have a more intense session.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like something just to be aware with the intensity. Some things I think about, post-workout strategies are a whole kind of different thing. But what I would tell you to start being aware of is, think about what's going to get your central nervous system back online the quickest. And so I know for me, red meat and white rice is a really good way to accomplish that. But I also used to eat right after training. And I also recognize that I do a little bit better eating 45 to 60 minutes after my workout. And that's kind of what gets my system in terms of mental acuity, energy back online the quickest. So that's kind of the principle I go back to, is what's going to get the CNS back alive versus, drooling on the ground for 10 minutes, staring at a ceiling fan, wondering what day it is.
So you're not doing jam on rice cakes anymore?
Not as much.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Yep. And I think we're getting kicked off, guys. So that's it. Talk to you guys later. Bye.